Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. This is Scaling Through Storytelling with Ruckus and Taktical. So this is being recorded. I'll send an email with a link once the recording is ready. And feel free to engage in the chat. If you have any follow-up questions, drop them there and we'll try to get them as soon as possible. And now to meet our hosts and speakers today's event.
Hi, my name's Anishs. So my background was helping to run growth for companies, both full-time and as a consultant for about a decade. Grew up in the Bay Area, moved to New York about 4 years ago, and ended up building out an executive recruiting firm about 4 years ago. Now we're a team of 15, basically working on hiring senior level folks across marketing, growth, product, analytics for fast-growing companies.
Hi, hey everybody, I'm Ilan. I am the chief strategist at Tactical Digital, which is a performance marketing agency. We work with a lot of venture-backed and private equity-backed firms, and D2C and B2B firms, companies like Parkbox and Casper and Benjamin Moore Paint and Influencer.com and guys like that. And our primary areas are performance marketing and paid social, paid search, SEO, content marketing, places like that.
Hey everybody, I'm Eva Goicochea and I'm the founder and CEO of Mod, which is a modern sexual wellness company based here in New York. I was one of the first employees at Everlane and been building brands for a decade plus, and really have just consulted for a number of brands around social media and content strategy. So I'm excited to talk about something other than raising money or something else. I'm excited to talk about content and storytelling today.
Hey all, I'm Verena Von Pfetten. I'm the co-founder of Gossamer, a media-first cannabis brand that puts cannabis at the center of art, culture, fashion, activism, and education. My background is largely in media and storytelling. I spent over 8 years building and launching websites for different publishers, eventually moved into more specifically the content to commerce space. I oversaw Condé's first attempt at a wholly integrated content to commerce play with Lucky Shops, and have consulted with brands and platforms like Into the Glass and Glossier, Man Repeller, Instagram as a platform, Spring the shopping app, and ASOS. And I'm very excited because this conversation is really the sweet spot of what I love to talk about.
Awesome. So thanks everyone for attending, and thanks for the panelists for being here. So all of you who signed up for this event, when you signed up, you were asked to put in questions that you thought would be interesting for the expert panelists to take a stab at. And so we cherry picked the most interesting of the questions, put them in this deck here. And so that's where they're coming from. And this is a pretty broad question, but it's pretty hard to get to because I think everyone has their own kind of way of trying to back into this. But you know, when you are building a brand and when you are, you know, doing a lot of the efforts toward that, how do you track the effectiveness of it? What are things that you've noticed work for your specific brands, or different methodologies you've seen that have varying layers of kind of efficacy? This is really for anybody.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I'll start, and maybe if anyone wants to jump in. I'm probably going to have a somewhat idiosyncratic answer to this. Like I said, my background is largely in editorial and storytelling, most specifically in digital media. So I got my start at the Huffington Post back in late 2006, early 2007. So I have a lot of experience in terms of digital analytics and audience growth and conversion and time spent on site and all of that. But the way we built Gossamer was very much almost as a result of you know, a decade plus of overanalyzing storytelling and content. And the reality is that, as far as I'm concerned, quality trumps everything else. So I'm much more interested in engagement, and I don't even mean that from an analytic sense, I mean it in a genuine organic connection. So yes, we are looking at, how are things performing on social, how are our newsletters opening, like what sort of content, what sort of stories are people replying to and saying, I love this, but we also make a print magazine. One sort of layer to the Gossamer world is like, we are using storytelling in a very analog way. We make a physical product that I guess the only tracking we have is how many issues have sold and the feedback we get from people saying, I've read it and I loved it. So I'm not going to have the most specific answer in terms of how we decide what's effective and what's working, other than we try and stay really, really true to our brand voice, the world we are trying to build, the stories we care about, the values that are important to us. And I touched on this slightly in the intro, but for us, that is art and culture, activism, and education, obviously all through somewhat the lens of cannabis. So for us, is this adding value to our reader / our customer / our audience? We view them as one of the same. Is this something that is meaningful, or is this adding value to the industry at large, or is this adding value to a conversation around activism in and outside of the cannabis space? I think, both, I won't speak for you, Eva, but we are in slightly stigmatized and often very marginalized spaces, particularly depending on what you look like. And so for us, it's very, very important to keep that front and center of the storytelling and push that conversation forward. So that's sort of how we measure what's working and what's not working. And I can later, if it's of interest, get into it from like a product perspective around what storytelling around product looks like. But first and foremost, that is how we think about content and storytelling.
I think that to Verena's point, this is a little bit of a loaded question because it depends on what you mean by brand building, right? When you consider your brand, there's your breadth, right? How wide your brand goes, how many people know of your brand, but then there's also depth, how loyal people are to your brand, how much they love your brand, how much they advocate for your brand. And those are two very different things, right? Breadth can be measured by things like the social engagement, how many social followers you have, how much direct traffic you're getting to your site, how often you're seeing people share or something like that. In fact, sharing might be a depth thing. But with depth, you see things like repeat buying. You see things like you have like these super commenters who are sort of like, one of my favorite things to see when we're trying to help a brand grow is somebody will ask a question and then another member of the community will answer for the brand. The brand doesn't have to respond because somebody else will explain to answer that question. That is a sign of deep loyalty. And you're only going to have, let's say, 5% of your audience do that. That's all you need. Right? Because those people have this overwhelming effort or overwhelming results from those folks, those like super users that you get. And curating them, this is to Verena's point, is the quality of the work that you do will develop those few super fans. And whereas the breadth of work that you do, how much you're spending or something like that, will have an effect on how many people know you. And both matter in this instance.
I also quickly was going to say measuring brand effectiveness to me is also in having people be able to distill what the brand is across audiences. So if they can all sort of say the same thing, I think you're doing a great job of building the brand clearly. Obviously, there are a number of ways to measure it, but I think you want to be able to, that one sentence to describe what that company does, if that's repeated by customers and audience, that to me, that's what is measuring how effective the brand is.
That makes a lot of sense. And it sounds like a lot of the effectiveness is based on what Ilan and Eva mentioned, is seeing your customers or audience being able to sort of like mimic what you've put out there and understand what you've put out there and be able to put it into their own words. I
kind of repeated it once. I'm sorry.
No. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Are there any sort of anecdotes where you've seen where you've been like super excited, where you've maybe seen on comment sections or people talking about your brand in certain places, like, oh wow, they really get it, and here's some of the foundational work where that we put in that led to this person or this commenter or journalist or anything like really getting it?
I think definitely reviews. Sorry. Go ahead.
No, please.
I was going to say, I think in the reviews, when they do what sort of Ilan said, which is repeat back to you what you are, like they recognize those things and take the time to include what you stand for in the reviews. They go beyond just product. I think that's always the most interesting thing, because you're seeing impact from a much greater perspective than like stars.
Yeah, I was gonna say for us, it's also, again, I mean, cannabis, you know, it is a conversation people are starting to get more comfortable having, but to build a brand in the cannabis space is like inherently very, very difficult. It is still a like point blank federally illegal product. So we are talking about something that is classified as a drug, an illegal one. And so for us, probably like the number one thing I love to see is when someone says, I love Gossamer and I don't even smoke weed. And that to me means we are really bridging that gap, and we are building a brand that is accessible, that is inclusive. And I'm not necessarily trying to convert people to cannabis. Like that's, you know, it's not what we're trying to do. If it's for you, it's great. If it's something you're curious about, we want to be here and be a resource or be, a resource or a source, but the idea is more to make this a conversation that people are comfortable having. And so for us, if Gossamer is a brand that enables that or allows that, and if we see that from people who would otherwise, you know, be afraid to even mention the word weed, that's where I know what we're doing is really working.
That's awesome. That makes a lot of sense. And, you know, for the audience, both Eva and Verena work on products that do have some level of restriction and limitation at certain times, right? So you have to really get, I don't know if the right word is ambassadors or super fans, but you really need to get people behind and loving what you're doing, because it isn't as easy to spread as something that has fewer restrictions and regulations and all of that. And you know, with Gossamer, what is the full kind of suite of things that you're putting out there into the world?
Yeah, so we have 3 different levels. We have a print magazine that we put out twice a year. We almost view it a little bit closer to a book. That is sort of what we would describe as like the axle of the wheel of Gossamer. Like it is the center of everything. It is also inherently going to be our smallest audience, but our most dedicated. Like the person that is picking up the print magazine, you know, that is almost our version of a brand ambassador. One thing I always say is like, I have a background in digital. I know how to get content in front of someone through, you know, the traditional digital means. I can hand you a magazine, I can't make you read it. And so that decision is returning some agency back to the customer and the audience, which I actually think is extremely important. I want someone to make that choice of their own volition. So print magazine first. We have obviously a website and social platforms and a newsletter, but we view everything as very platform specific. So all of our content that we publish online goes out in full in the newsletter. I'm not trying to drive someone to a secondary platform. I want to meet them where they are. I don't want to add any steps. Same with social. And then the third level is products. So we have a couple wholly owned products that are in the CBD space and adjacent to it that are available nationally. And then we do collaborations with brands in the cannabis space and on the lifestyle side. So we have THC products on the market in California. And then we have done clothing, apparel, home goods collabs to, again, continue to bridge the gap between cannabis and the larger lifestyle space and try and meet people where they are.
Makes a lot of sense. And then Eva, what's the full suite of products that BOD sort of sells?
So it's primarily a product company, and we sell our own products. It's not like we're not a retailer. And I think at last count, we're probably up to like 25 products. It's across, we say for before, during, and after. So it's across like sexual wellness and bath and body, and scent. And then the content side of the site, like I said, it probably has 4 to 5 times more traffic than the product side itself, just because of the category. So while we have content, we're still a small team, and it's something that, and I think anyone who's built content knows, like, you want to do it in a smart way. So we're not trying to invest everything and flip the composition of the company, but we're trying to have content live side by side.
That's amazing. Yeah. And that's amazing that you get 4 to 5x on the content versus like the direct products, right?
Well, surprisingly, people don't have sex as often as you Same thing. So they come back to the site like 3 times a year to buy product maybe, but they're reading the content every week.
Makes a lot of sense. They have more questions than needs immediately. Okay, cool. Thanks for that. We can jump on the next question.
No, this is interesting.
Yeah.
I think this really speaks to, as you're evolving as a startup and moving forward, what do you have to keep in mind? What do you have to think about? Do you have to think, are we evolving? Do we need to pivot? Have there been certain points where you've hit some level of kind of friction or anything like that with kind of like V1 of your brand versus where you think you could take it into, like, I guess V2 of both your brand and both the storyline of your organization?
Well, can I tell a quick story? So when
I'd
I
love
was
that.
at when I was at Everlane, I was like number 6 or 7, and the whole proposition was like 10 products under $100, which
Mhm.
sounds okay. You're like, okay, that makes sense. Maybe I'll buy a couple things. That's not a brand. So that's just what you're offering in terms of your product. And as soon as they found radical transparency, it changed everything. So my feedback to brands, like, our radical transparency is modern intimacy. It doesn't actually matter what we make. It's just that you understand the brand and the lens by which we are like telling the story. So that means that if you understand that we're a modern intimacy brand, we should be able to offer content, commerce, a hotel, whatever. Like, we should be able to be anything. So that's really important, is recognizing first that you have to have something to tell a story from, and it cannot be your value proposition as it relates to your price point or something else. Because that really limits you. So that's my like key takeaway, I think, in my career, was recognizing the difference between really product companies and then I know we said lifestyle was a bit of a bad word, but like lifestyle companies and really companies that are mission based.
First, from a publishing perspective, whether you are a brand, whether you're a platform, once you start to layer in both commerce, content, whatever internal initiatives you have, you have to start to decide how you're prioritizing those things and how you are choosing what to do and when. And so to Eva's point, which I think you put very, very succinctly, you have to have a core vision that helps you streamline that. So for us, it is, we are a brand for people who also smoke weed. And that means you have a relationship to cannabis in some form or another. And as we've seen, that definition has expanded in the last 2 years, 3 years, 5 years. CBD wasn't even on anyone's radar 5 years ago. So for us, it's making sure that we are always communicating through that lens. And then in terms of pivoting, the only sort of anecdote I have is that when we launched product, we had a sense of we knew who our current audience was, and we had a sense of who the product would be for. But I think this is true of almost any brand. You're always going to reach maybe a customer base that is a little unexpected, or maybe wasn't necessarily your target. So for us, it was also the realization that, our content, which is a little more like esoteric, intellectual, playful, has a bit of like a weedy sense of humor. We also make CBD products that land very squarely in the wellness space. So we started seeing this cohort of customers that were a little bit older, a little bit more rural, using it for purely health, wellness, medical reasons. And so for us, we realized our content had to also address them as well. There may be not necessarily first and foremost, but we wanted to make sure we were delivering storytelling and editorial that spoke to their use cases. And that is a lot around education, explaining how things work, understanding how they can incorporate a product in their life in a way that isn't pure marketing, but really feels like we are helping them as a resource, whether they buy our products or someone else's.
Makes a lot of sense. I'd imagine as you continue to grow as a brand, you're getting a lot more feedback from this audience in terms of who they kind of hope you can end up being and what you can do for them. Are there any sort of anecdotes where some of the customer feedback you've gotten has helped you kind of like evolve what your overall brand and message has ended up becoming, based on, from all of this conversation and feedback, we've learned that our customers really, really, really want this particular thing out of us, either out of a brand or out of products or anything like that. So I'm curious if any of that feedback has helped evolve what you're putting out in the world.
I think education. It just, like, I think we learned that there is no such thing as too much. And sometimes when you are in a brand space or in a specific category, you can start to have this bubble or this tunnel vision that, like, of course, everyone knows what I'm talking about. Of course, everybody has heard of this or understands this or understands that. And the realization that that is not true. Unless you are literally the biggest brand in the world, and I would assume even then, it's still not true. You need to make sure you are giving people the resources to understand every piece of, you know, how they might be interacting with your brand, or more specifically your product. And sort of I think that sort of feedback loop of making sure that you take yourself out of the equation and really respond to what a customer or your audience is saying. Even if you feel like you're repeating yourself, even if you feel like, you know, you're sort of being unnecessary, it's just reminding a brand to meet people where they are. You know, take yourself out of the equation and really put your customer first. And whatever that is, whether that's education, entertainment, you know, destigmatization, there's a million different angles, but put the customer first.
Makes a lot of sense. I think that's really well said. We can jump to the next one. This is interesting. I think the last question was about, once you've already gotten some traction, how do you incorporate that feedback and feedback loop and learnings into what you're doing? This is kind of the opposite. When you don't have a lot of those kind of customer feedback loops and feedback, and overall kind of perfect idea of how to put the best thing out in the world. You know, how do you debut a brand into the world? What are some steps before that launch that you take to try to better understand what you're doing? And any anecdotes from, you know, I think Eva had a good anecdote with Everlane early in the days, just focusing on the price point, not on the bigger, broader mission. But would love to hear anything about that, both from the planning side and then also from just general anecdotes of what you've seen go sort of right and less than right.
I think when we think about product, it's like, one, is this a product that people would imagine that we make? Is it something they've asked for? And is it something that they would understand how to use with the rest of the product? So once you sort of get that in order, I think telling the story around the why, whether that is because of the customer or not, is really important. And then being able to, I would say, peel back the layers of like how we got to this product, how we made it, giving them a bit more as to why you launch something is important, because we're living in a really saturated world of product. I think everybody sees products all the time. And I always say, like, you should not leave it up to the customer to have to know what you are doing. They should be able to remember it really quickly. So make it as easy as possible for them to get why you made something, why it's here, and then how to use it. I know that sounds like really basic advice, but
no.
I think that people like,
I don't think that's basic at all.
Yeah, I think people overestimate how important we are in a consumer's life. And yes, there are super fans, but also like just do them the favor of making it really easy to understand, so that it's something that they would want.
Yeah, I think there's I have two sort of thoughts on this. One is a little more anecdotal, and you know, an example I love to share with Glossier and Boy Brow. You know, that's like a hero product that has been written about over and over again as this item that like launched with like a 10,000 person wait list and continues to sell out. Glossier obviously came out of a company called Into the Gloss that was media first. And if you look at the way Into the Gloss, while, you know, ultimately being an independent entity, seeded a conversation around eyebrows before they launched a product for eyebrows, you start to whet your customer's appetite. You know, they started doing content around like beautiful bushy brows, around how to get those boyish brows, around eyebrow shapers. You know, you do that very slowly, very organically, with true value to the audience, whether it's about your product or not. You start to seed a conversation so that when a product launches, all of a sudden you have a customer base that's sort of like, oh yeah, I need this because I've just spent the last little while thinking about my eyebrows in a way that I had not before. So that's, I think, one maybe more strategic approach. The other side for us, speaking specific to Gossamer, is we really were purely an editorial platform before we launched product. So we launched our first product based exclusively off of our customer base, or what it then was our readership, saying, I need this one thing. And for us, that was, I need something to help me sleep that is readily available to me. So people were starting to hear about CBD. They were obviously starting to hear a conversation around cannabis and sort of wellness, and as like an antidote to modern times. But they felt like there wasn't anything on the market that they could purchase easily, i.e., in whatever state they were, or even in a legal state, without having to go into a dispensary, which is still a leap for a lot of people. And as we started looking around, as we've been covering the space and trying to vet CBD products, the one thing we saw was everyone marketing CBD for sleep, but not necessarily speaking to the fact of the formulation, or that CBD doesn't actually help you sleep, quite frankly. Like, CBD can help with some of the symptoms that might be preventing sleep, but it's not going to put you to sleep. So we saw this hole in the market of people doing some kind of shady marketing and launching products that weren't effective for the use case that people were asking for, and said, well, we know a lot about this market. We know a lot about the customer and what they want. Can we make a product that actually answers that question? And that was Dusk. And so we launched Dusk. Very small company, no investment, testing a product, and sold out within, I think, 17 days, based purely on one Instagram and one newsletter that we sent. And that was that. And then the second product was Dawn, similarly a daytime CBD for waking up. And it came from our customer saying, I love Dusk. I need something that's going to help me in the morning, or I have no problem sleeping. I need something that's going to help me during the day. So that sort of storytelling around, like, why we made this for you. Here is how it works. Here is why it's different from everything else out there. That's how we sort of view building a successful launch. If you don't start those pieces really early and you try and backfill them, I think it either comes across as meaningless or is largely meaningless.
I think to building on Verena's point, she makes a very valid point about preceding. If I were to use examples of companies that do it well or companies that do it poorly, first, a fail, in my opinion, would be Amazon's original Prime Video service. Now, the Prime Video service is like 15 years old at this point. Most of us, if we're using Prime Video, we're probably only using it in the past few years. It really struggled in the beginning because it made no sense. Why was Amazon doing video? What was the nature of it? They had to go through multiple iterations and pour enormous sums of money into the service to ultimately get it to become popular, which it is now. That is an example of trying to backfill after the fact, or trying to explain yourself after the fact. But when it comes to doing it correctly, I see two different ways that companies can do this. One is that companies can have a brand story that is structured in a manner that allows them to introduce lots of different kinds of products well outside of where they started, if their position is such that it makes sense and doesn't box them in. So a good example of this is Apple. Apple is a computer company, but we buy our phones from them, we buy headphones from them, we watch content from them, because their brand has nothing to do with computers. Their brand positioning is we're differentiators, we're rebels, we'll take something that's done a certain way and we'll rethink it from the ground up and we'll do it over again. And so it doesn't matter what they offer us, because we'll accept it from them, because the concept has to do with the disruption of a certain space. Another company that does it well, but in a different way, I think, is Elon Musk with Tesla, and both SpaceX and Tesla. What SpaceX and Tesla do is they set this goal, this far off goal. So with SpaceX, it's get to Mars. And with Tesla is make the world less dependent on oil. These are broad, sort of end of the line goals. And everything that they do and they build on the way to that goal now makes more sense. Like you can retroactively understand why they would build pickup trucks, why they would build AI, why they would buy Solar City, why they would introduce the power bank, things that, if Tesla's a car company, why does it have a home battery system? It's weird. But in the context of that far off goal of what they're trying to achieve, you can logically add it to your mind. You go, no, that makes sense because Tesla needs to do this to get to the next phase. And so that's two ways that companies, I think, do it correctly, either by having the correct positioning from the beginning, which I think Eva also spoke about, is having your position be correct in the beginning. If your product is not going to fit into the grand circle and you can't show it as being a part of that broad circle or being part of that broad collection or facing a goal or what you're trying to do, then either the product needs to change or the brand needs to adjust. And then you'll find it'll be a lot easier and products will just debut themselves at a certain point.
It makes a lot of sense. And probably Ilan, you see, since you run a performance marketing agency, you see a lot of earlier stage companies probably coming to you alongside their brand launch to run their first set of ads on the paid side and potentially set up their first landing pages to get them some traction in organic search. Is there sort of a checklist you run companies through if they haven't ever ran their first ad before, to get them to think about all the right questions, make sure their sort of ducks are in a row?
Of course. I think the basic things that anybody should be doing before they run their first brand is do a exercise in coming up with personas, decide who you're talking to, what do they sound like, what do they look like, what clubs are they a part of. You should have a brand voice ready, whether that's your own voice or just the type of attitude that your company's going to have. Is it going to speak in the third person? Is it going to speak in the first person? Is it going to be casual? Is it going to be formal? These sorts of standard exercises, even if you're not going to build like a formal brand book and a brand guide, like if you're not going to hire an agency to do that for you, just asking yourselves these questions forces you to start making decisions about what you want to start off on. And for nothing, you can change it always, especially when you're young and you're small and nobody knows you. You can always change and evolve, but you have to have consistency when you start. You can't not have the consistency when you start, because then it just comes off as weird. And I've had situations where some customers or some people didn't even know if the Facebook and the Instagram were from the same company. Like they didn't know if that was is this the Instagram for this company? I was just on the Facebook. It can get confusing. So pushing yourself to ask yourself these questions first will at least get you to the place where you can begin to communicate and then evolve over time.
I want to just jump on that because it both helps inform outward facing, but it really also helps inform inward facing decision making as well. I think if you have a really clear understanding of what your brand is, whether that's how you speak, the people you speak to, why you are speaking, that informs the decision making around what you do as well. I know, I've seen that both at companies I've consulted with. I see that internally. Like if you can always refer back and say, well, Gossamer is this or Mod is this, it helps you decide, if there's an internal conversation around like, well, should we launch a product like this or should we launch a car? If you have a very strong understanding of who and what your brand is, that can answer the question. And I think that really also helps prioritize what you do.
That makes a lot of sense. Is there any value, right, as you're debuting to go out, let's say with performance marketing ads, let's say on paid social, just testing like 10 different brand voices in all kinds of different directions to see how people react, especially since you are new and you can be a lot more experimental and won't stick with you as much? Or does that kind of go against the whole idea of what some of you were saying of really knowing your mission up front and clarifying it and being a little bit more narrow and specific with it? I don't know if Ilan, you've seen some companies kind of experiment with that, or where it worked, or whether it was just chaotic all over the place and you couldn't really get any great results from it.
I think it's more the latter, actually, unfortunately. And this is going to go into our next question, which this is a good segue into how do stats and data play a role. It takes, and I'm sure the other two panelists are going to have a deeper thought on this. It takes a lot of discipline to be able to craft your story and stick to it. It is really easy to allow yourself to devolve into the shortest version of yourself. It's very easy to go after clickbaity headlines. It's very easy to just get wrapped up in like, okay, this ad is it's getting the highest conversion rate. Let's just go with this ad. And that's when you end up with sloppy storytelling, because these ads are speaking to little mini groups and they're not cohesive with each other and you're all over the place. And so while it's important to allow your audience to give you feedback, and of course, if your brand isn't growing and you're not seeing success, something is wrong. But it's a really scary game to try to use sort of initial data and immediate responses to try to gauge who you are. And I also think that's how you end up with something that's not genuine, right? It doesn't mean anything to you or anybody who works for you because you're just sort of following along. I think there's an old anecdote about a king who sees a mob of people with pitchforks running down the boulevard, and he goes, "There go my people. I have to find out where they're going so I can lead them." Right? That's not being a leader, right? That's following the crowd. It's following the mob, and then that's how you get distracted, I think, personally.
Makes a lot of sense. That's also how you end up with like a Frankenstein of patched together, like, oh, this worked over here and this worked over here. Let's just kind of inorganically patch it together and decide who we are from that. And I see a lot of that in terms of companies who are following what the trend is and what's working for other organizations in terms of their branding, in terms of their messaging, and just trying to incorporate into their own because that's the hot new thing. Instead of just being like, oh no, what I'm doing is going to be different. And even if it's not on brand or on trend, even if it's not on trend with what's happening in 2021, we're going to stick with it because we're going to continue being unique and being ourselves. So I think that makes a lot of sense.
And it really depends on what you're trying to do. You know, as much as I would love to say, sorry about the background noise, that, you know, every brand, every company out there is doing it for purely organic, genuine, quality reasons. I mean, that's not really true. I wish that were the case. It's not true. And I think something we think about internally, and I know this is like a quote that gets thrown around a lot, but like things of quality have no fear of time, right? If you are making something that is really meaningful and that you believe has longstanding value, and that is genuinely, you know, different from everything else that is out there, trends and sort of following like this quick new thing shouldn't really matter. That isn't to say you shouldn't be reactive, but I do think the other sort of framework through which I view things, and this is something I thought about from an perspective, and now I very much think from a brand perspective. But the question you should ask yourself every single day is, if we disappeared tomorrow, would anyone miss us? Or would what we do just be filled by the people on either side? And I think if you can't say like yes to that, then also something's wrong. Or maybe you should what you're.
I think that's really great. And it's really a good sort of North Star to make sure what you're doing matters, which is actually really hard to do. I think where I've seen a lot of founders stumble on that is when they start talking to investors, and investors will always want you to do whatever is hot because, hey, company X is now worth this valuation. Can you just be a little bit more like them? And so I've talked to founders where, you know, we'll chat about their hiring plans and whatnot. And, you know, we end up not working with them because it sounds like what they're talking about sounds like a mishmash of what lots of investors and advisors told them to pivot their company towards versus what they kind of believe. Like if, you know, you're selling a very normal product that doesn't need deep technology and somehow you tell me there's AI built in because some investor will put more money in, you know, if you say that now that in the pitch, it's, you know, you're suddenly now going in a direction that was never really where you wanted to in the first place. So yeah, I think to a lot of what you've mentioned, like sticking to your guns and knowing who you are, and that you will continue to be who the company that you want to create and build. It's difficult because people want to give you money to do something completely different.
Yeah, one other thing I'll say just specifically around storytelling and editorial, because I think this is something, you know, a lot of brands are like, oh, I have to have my own editorial platform now, right? We have to have storytelling, we have to have a voice. And I still think the majority of them, and this is kind of like the topic of this panel, think about it as a means to an end. Storytelling as a form of marketing that is going to convert your audience. While it absolutely can and, you know, ideally should do that, I really, really also encourage people to think of storytelling and editorial as its own product. That it is not necessarily a product that converts to another product. View it the same way you would view a product. Are people buying that thing of its own accord? And, you know, buying meaning reading, consuming. taking value, passing it to their friends. You really have to treat storytelling and editorial that way. Otherwise, it's just marketing all over again. And that's fine, but then it's not editorial and storytelling, and you're not going to get the same value out of it. The best versions of the thing don't focus very much on the brand at all. They just expand the brand world. They might be helpful for education around product and understanding the space and category and how something's used, but really it stands on its own merit and is consumed on its own merit. So, number one, I would say is like, make sure that the number one lens that you are looking through storytelling at is not, does it convert into product sales? That should be in there, but that should not be the number one metric.
Makes a lot of sense. And you obviously have a very deep background in editorial and content, and understanding what kind of editorial and content is exciting for broad and specific audiences. But another founder, that may not be them, right? So them trying to be you, that can actually speak away from the DNA of an organization. I do talk to founders sometimes about like talent fit, and figuring out what's your superpower. Don't say, well, hey, Verena built this great company on content. Let me build it on content, if that's not their thing. And I think a lot of what you mentioned about content has to come with experience, taste level, really just having some experience to understand what works. And if someone's coming from a completely other world, they can't just copy paste what you did, but they can, speak to what their own strengths is.
Yeah.
Maybe like they're really great on supply chain and operational efficiency, and you can really build a company on the backbone of that and maybe focus elsewhere to start building your audiences. Or you're really great at performance marketing and paid search. Doesn't mean you have to build a content powerhouse because you're competitive. Your main competitor is. So I think also digging in to figure out what your own strengths are, and not trying to copy everyone else who's out there.
100% agree. Like, not everyone needs a fully robust, like, separate editorial or storytelling platform. I know it's buzzy and like it's something that we've seen can be very, very effective, but it's not necessary. And there are other forms of it, as you just said. And I think that's a really, really important distinction.
Yeah, absolutely. And hopefully people stick to like some of their own DNA and their own path. And so products and brands don't all feel kind of the same, like I think they did maybe about 3-4 years ago. Cool. Let's jump into the next one. This is actually really fascinating, and it's really interesting for our audience because a lot of them come from a performance marketing world. And I think there are a lot of misconceptions about the value of brand storytelling and how it speaks to actually building a business, with some people on the performance marketing lens not really believing in it having as much impact because it's a little bit harder to attribute, which we touched upon in the past kind of question. So are there any consistent misconceptions that you kind of hear about storytelling and how it relates to kind of like the advantages towards your business?
I think the fact that anybody in performance doubts it is, Patagonia exists because of storytelling. Like, all birds exist because of storytelling. I think, while Warby may have started with a value prop around like pricing, they have really created a world, right? So all of these brands you can imagine in a multitude of mediums, and that's what storytelling is about, is creating a world in which your consumer can jump in and understand. It's everything. And storytelling isn't just, to Verena's point, it's not just like content, it's not blog posts, it's like it's building and weaving together what you stand for, what you look like, how you sound, all of it.
Yeah, I think I was going to say the biggest misconception is probably that it doesn't scale, that like editorial or storytelling doesn't scale. I've had no shortage of conversations with them on the Gossamer side of things, but even at some of the other brands I've worked with. And the question is like, okay, but so when is the editorial part going away? It's great because it got you somewhere, but like, okay, at what point do you deprioritize that? Because you really have to prioritize selling product. And I think that's the biggest misconception, is that those two things really do go hand in hand. Obviously, you have to make internal decisions around who and how people are spending their time and what is effective or not effective. But I really think you need to it goes back to what I said. It can't just be a means to an end. It has to be part of a larger brand building world. If you're talking about storytelling to build a brand, then we're all in alignment. If you're talking about storytelling to sell product, that's a different conversation. And I think the conversation we're having right now is storytelling to build a brand, and that's where the value is.
Well said. That makes a lot of sense. Jump to the next one. This is interesting. I wonder if it does relate perfectly to this topic, but are there specific channels that you've been able to see kind of growth from your storytelling efforts while also, being fairly cost efficient?
Press and affiliate and content, and which really lifts up like the organic and direct growth a lot. And we keep our CAC down because of it. As we both know, like the category can be trepidatious when you're trying to navigate advertising, and anyway, that's not always the consumer you want, is somebody that sees you in a Facebook ad. So it's storytelling over and over again in all of these channels, and that has definitely led to a cost-efficient acquisition for us.
Yeah, I mean, the fact I'll share, we've done no paid advertising to date. Zero paid spend. Obviously, we spend money on content. Our value add is also that we have partnerships. So for us, this editorial, this brand marketing, it's paid for. We have zero marketing spend across the board. And even if that weren't the case, because you don't necessarily have to have an editorial platform that like operates almost like a traditional editorial platform with advertisers, you can have your own. I would almost guarantee across the board that it would still be less expensive than marketing spend of most companies. And when done right, it can be so effective. And there's far less churn, and you are getting an extremely high quality audience. To speak to Eva's point about whether do you want someone who saw your company through a Facebook ad? I know those are extremely effective. Is that the customer you really want? Maybe at a certain point, in order to hit a point of scale and you're layering them in, sure. But I really do think that, for us, it has been hands down the most cost-effective way to grow. We are a cannabis brand that has THC on the market and has a national presence with zero paid marketing. I think we are the only one, and also with zero institutional investment. We are absolutely the only one. So, if you need proof as to how storytelling can help you build a brand and keep costs down, I mean,
That's awesome. Thank you so much for digging in that and really showing the value of what you're doing and how it's kind of leading to actual business growth and not just views and whatnot. So that's awesome. And Eva, you mentioned press. Are there any tips for people who've never really gone after press or never gotten any press? I think for those who have never done it before, it can feel like a black box of how to, get your name out there, and especially if you don't have those personal connections with the right journalists and the right people who can connect you to the journalists. Would love any kind of thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so we started building press before we launched, actually, to go back to what we were saying about pre-launching a product or a company. And it was outreach, and it usually came from me. So if you're helming the company, I think writers like to know. I always say, everybody wants to know a guy. Everybody wants to have a guy for something, right? And it's the same thing I would say with writers. They want to get directly to you. They want to know that if they're pulling for a story, they can just get it straight from the horse's mouth. And so it takes a lot of time to build a Rolodex, but it's not necessarily time spent out knocking on doors and getting coffee. It's time spent on the internet figuring out who writes what and when and what the value is. And there are two sides to press. There's obviously affiliate and just regular press, but we get so much press, and it's really just built off of being consistent around letting them know what we have coming up, letting them know that we exist, consistent storytelling around what we stand for, and just generally trying to do as much work for them as we can. And there have been moments throughout this journey that we've had PR teams and they can't get us the press that we can get ourselves. I don't know that works for everybody, but I do think there's value in knowing a guy.
Strong agree. As someone who's comes very much from the press and editorial side. Obviously, yes, one of our advantages is that, like, I used to work at the magazines and publications that I'm now talking to. But the number one piece of advice I always have is, like, a writer or an editor's or journalist job is not to sell your product. And your job, if you're trying to get a pitch in front of them or get something taken, is to make their job easier. So what is their job? Their job is to provide value to their audience. So how is what you are pitching providing value to their audience? Not how is what you are pitching going to provide value back to you? That is not going to get a pitch sold. So help make their job easier. And so for us, one of the ways we do that with Gossamer is, like, I will talk about anybody. I will recommend products that aren't our own. I will talk about the cannabis space. I will be a resource so that editors and writers who, are trying to wade through a very, very confusing and very murky and ever evolving landscape, I can help do that. I can help be that expert, even if it doesn't directly lead back to buy this Gossamer product. But what that does do is make me a very helpful resource to editors and writers, so that when we do have a product launch, they're excited, they feel like Gossamer stands for something, they feel like we've been helpful, and hopefully they believe in what we're doing enough that there's excitement around a product launch.
Awesome. Thanks for that. I think that actually helps a lot of people to have some tips on how to reach out to writers and journalists and actually feel like, hey, I'm providing value to you, not just giving you my, like, byline and master pitch for my product. So that's awesome.
Answer the question in chat about how do you provide value on a weekly or monthly basis if nothing is new and changing the brand? Because we experience that often. We don't release products, a few times a year, but I would say it's the homework of, like, what are they writing about? And then saying, hey, I know it's summer's coming up and you probably write about this because you wrote about it last year. Like, we think that whatever we're offering would be really great for this story. So it's doing the damn homework.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I feel like at this point, my life is sponsored by Airtable, but I really believe, like, get in there and organize yourself and start to tag, like, what have they written about before? And what does it make sense for them to write about in the future, so that you're really on top of sending them things that make sense? Because you're right, just saying hi isn't really going to get you anywhere.
Yeah, I'll add one thing to that too, because we also don't launch a lot of products. We try and keep things very, very tight. And if you are in a brand space, you're in a category, that category really, really, really well, often even better than people that are covering it, because, like, editors and writers are stretched more thin than ever. It's impossible for them to really spend as much time in the space as you do. So I think also offering, tips is, like, a very, like, reportery way to put it, but sort of like tips on trends and conversations that might be relevant to their audience, again, whether they incorporate you or not. If you sort of cultivate a relationship with some of these writers or these editors and are able to say, like, hey, there's a conversation bubbling up around, for us, what an example that we did even before we launched our product, and this, I guess I talked earlier about seeding a conversation with your audience about, what might get them excited. So for us, we started covering more sleep before launching a sleep product. We also knew that our product, Dusk specifically, everyone was just talking about CBD, CBD, CBD. And I know editors, like, their eyes were rolling out of their heads and, like, down the street if they hear CBD one more time. So what did I know about the space that I realized editors didn't? That there are 130 different cannabinoids behind CBD, all of which do something slightly different. So before we launched our product, which uses CBN, which is a secondary cannabinoid, I started having conversations with editors about, like, hey, you're probably really sick of covering CBD. Have you realized, or do you know that there are, all of these other cannabinoids? And this is, like, really, really interesting research and probably going to blow up the conversation around what CBD does. So we started seeding those pieces with press, so that even before they were including us, so that then when we said, hey, by the way, 3 months later, I have a product to announce, it uses CBN, it's not CBD, it's very focused on the specific cannabinoid. There was an appetite, the audience was interested, it added value, it was very, very different from everything they've been covering. So it goes, even beyond just, like, keeping in touch and letting them know what's happening. Is really, like, helping educate them in a way that at least certainly initially, like is not at all self-serving and is really much more about broadening the space and helping educate them on something you know very, very well.
Awesome. Yeah, that's super helpful. I think, yeah, and your advice was just write the article for them. So they don't have to do all the research work themselves, and give them all the factoids to go out there to write an interesting article, and instead of just being, hey, my company does X, which is a great tip. Cool. Well, we're at time now. I want to thank all of our panelists and all of our audience for coming here. I learned a ton of stuff about how to scale a brand. So thanks, Eva, thanks, Verena, and thanks, Ilan.